1983, Australia was about to witness one of the greatest endurance races on Earth, an 875-kilometer ultramarathon stretching from Sydney to Melbourne. Nearly 545 miles of unforgiving roads, freezing nights, burning afternoons, swollen feet, hallucinations, and exhaustion. A race so brutal that even elite athletes questioned whether the human body was truly built to finish it. The competitors had spent months preparing. Some had professional coaches, some had sponsorships, most had years of ultramarathon experience. Every one of them believed they understood what it took to survive. Then an old farmer arrived. He wasn't wearing expensive running shoes. He wasn't surrounded by a support team. He didn't even look like a runner. He was 61 years old. He showed up wearing overalls, carrying a small bag, and a pair of heavy work boots. People thought he had come to watch. Instead, he walked up to the registration table and quietly said he wanted to enter the race. The room went silent. Some laughed. Others assumed he was confused, because there was no possible way this old man belonged here. But 5 days later, every single professional runner would be chasing him, and the world would discover that sometimes the greatest advantage is not knowing the rules everyone else follows. This is the unbelievable true story of Cliff Young. Long before ultramarathons became popular, before GPS watches, carbon-plated shoes, sports scientists, and energy gels, endurance running was still a mysterious frontier. One race stood above them all: the Westfield Sydney to Melbourne Ultramarathon. First held in 1983, it wasn't just another marathon. It wasn't even close. Instead of the standard 42 kilometers, runners had to cover 875 kilometers. Imagine running from New York City to Cleveland, or from London to Edinburgh, without stopping. The race followed the Hume Highway, one of Australia's busiest roads. Competitors faced traffic, changing weather, steep hills, and endless stretches of lonely pavement. Most people couldn't drive that distance in a single day. These athletes were expected to run it. The best competitors usually finished in about 5 days. But there was a catch. No one actually ran nonstop. Every experienced ultramarathon runner followed the same strategy. Run for around 18 hours. Sleep for 6. Wake up. Repeat. Because no matter how strong you were, the human body eventually demanded rest. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. When race day arrived, journalists gathered to interview the competitors. The runners looked exactly as people expected. Lean, young, muscular. Their legs were covered in compression gear, bright running shoes, specialized clothing. Some had physiotherapists checking their muscles. Others reviewed race plans with their teams. It looked less like a race and more like a professional sporting event. Then cameras suddenly turned toward someone standing quietly near the back. He looked completely out of place. His name was Cliff Young. He was 61 years old. He wasn't a professional athlete. He wasn't even retired. He was still working every day on a potato farm in Victoria. His face was deeply weathered by decades under the Australian sun. He had missing teeth. His clothes looked like they had come straight from the farm. Instead of sleek racing shoes, he wore heavy work boots. Even after changing footwear later, he still moved awkwardly compared to everyone else. Reporters couldn't believe he had entered. One journalist finally asked the obvious question: "Are you really planning to run all the way to Melbourne?" Cliff smiled. "Yes." The reporter hesitated. "Have you ever run this far before?" Cliff answered honestly, "No." People laughed. Another reporter asked him why he thought he could finish a race designed for elite athletes. His answer was surprisingly simple. "I grew up on a farm." The journalists looked confused. So Cliff explained. His family didn't own horses. Sometimes storms would roll in unexpectedly. When thousands of sheep scattered across enormous fields, someone had to bring them back. That someone was usually Cliff. He would spend days chasing sheep across rugged countryside, sometimes for 2, sometimes even 3 days without proper sleep. He wasn't training. He was simply doing his job. To everyone listening, it sounded ridiculous. Chasing sheep wasn't the same as running an ultramarathon. Professional athletes trained scientifically. They measured heart rates, nutrition, recovery, pacing. This old farmer measured none of those things. As interviews continued, the contrast became almost comical. The professionals talked about split times and race strategy. Cliff talked about sheep. The professionals discussed hydration formulas. Cliff wondered whether the weather would stay cool. The professionals looked like champions. Cliff looked like somebody's grandfather who had accidentally wandered into the wrong event. Newspapers barely mentioned him. Most assumed he would quit within the first day. Some doubted he could even finish the opening hours. After all, he was over 60. At an age when many people were thinking about retirement, he had decided to attempt one of the hardest races ever created. It simply didn't make sense. Then the starting gun fired. The pack exploded forward. Professional runners immediately settled into an aggressive pace. Years of training had taught them exactly how fast to begin. Their strides were smooth, controlled, efficient. Cliff did something completely different. He didn't sprint. He didn't even run normally. Instead, he shuffled, tiny, quick steps, almost like he was gently jogging without ever lifting his feet very high off the ground. It looked awkward, almost clumsy. Spectators laughed. Some thought he might be injured. Others assumed he simply didn't know how to run. Nobody imagined they were looking at a movement that would later become famous around the world as the Cliff Young Shuffle. Hour after hour, the leaders pulled farther ahead. As expected, Cliff drifted toward the back of the field. Television crews stopped filming him. Why waste camera time on someone who clearly wouldn't matter? By sunset, the race had already begun taking its toll. Feet blistered, leg muscles tightened. Some runners quietly admitted they had started too fast, but everything was still going according to plan. As darkness fell across the highway, the professionals reached their scheduled stopping points. Support crews prepared hot meals, fresh clothes, massage tables, sleeping bags. Recovery was part of the strategy. Tomorrow would be another incredibly long day. Meanwhile, somewhere farther down the road, headlights illuminated a lone figure still moving through the darkness. Step after step, shuffle after shuffle. No support vehicle, no medical team, no comfortable bed waiting nearby. Just an old farmer moving steadily into the Australian night. Race officials assumed he would stop eventually. He never did. Through midnight, past exhausted competitors already asleep, past silent campsites. Cliff simply kept moving. Nobody paid much attention. Not yet, because everyone believed the race had only just begun. None of them realized they were watching history unfold. Morning arrived. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the Australian countryside, professional runners slowly crawled out of their sleeping bags. Some rubbed sore knees. Others struggled to stand. A few had barely slept at all. But this was normal. Every ultramarathon runner knew recovery was just as important as running. They ate breakfast, stretched, checked their feet, and prepared for another long day on the road. Then someone looked at the race standings. Cliff Young had never stopped. At first, nobody believed it. There had to be a mistake. Surely the old farmer had pulled over somewhere without the officials noticing. But checkpoint after checkpoint confirmed the same unbelievable fact. He had been moving all night, slowly, steadily, without sleep. The professionals got back on the road. One by one, they began passing runners who had struggled during the night. Eventually, they expected to catch Cliff too. Instead, the gap wasn't shrinking. It was getting smaller much more slowly than anyone expected. Because while the professionals had rested for 6 hours, Cliff had quietly covered dozens of additional kilometers. His pace wasn't fast. In fact, it was slower than almost everyone else's. But unlike everyone else, his pace almost never changed. Hour after hour, day after day, he just kept shuffling forward. Soon, reporters began noticing something unusual. Every few hours, Cliff would appear at another checkpoint, looking tired, but still smiling, still moving. When journalists asked him why he wasn't sleeping, Cliff looked genuinely confused. Sleep? He didn't say it like a strategy. He said it like it had never occurred to him. To him, the goal was simple: get to Melbourne. Why would he stop if the finish line was still ahead? The reporters laughed, but slowly. The laughter disappeared, because Cliff wasn't just surviving anymore. He was climbing the leaderboard. Every night followed the same pattern. The professionals stopped. Cliff didn't. Every morning, he was farther ahead than anyone expected. Something extraordinary was happening. The old farmer everyone had dismissed was now threatening to win the entire race. Spectators gathered in larger and larger crowds. Television stations that had ignored him during the first day suddenly couldn't stop talking about him. Across Australia, people became fascinated by this unlikely hero. Children stayed up late asking their parents whether the old farmer was still running. Families turned on the evening news, hoping for another update. Nobody could understand how a man in his 60s was outperforming athletes half his age. The answer turned out to be surprisingly simple. Cliff had spent most of his life working on his family's farm. Whenever storms rolled across the countryside, thousands of sheep could scatter over enormous distances. Finding them wasn't a matter of hours. Sometimes it took days. Without horses, without vehicles, just walking, jogging, and refusing to stop until every animal was safely home. For decades, his body had unknowingly adapted to something remarkably similar to ultramarathon endurance. He had never trained for races. Life had trained him instead. Even more remarkable, Cliff had never studied modern endurance strategy. Nobody had taught him that sleeping 6 hours every night was considered essential. So he never questioned it. He simply kept moving. Sometimes, not knowing the accepted way of doing things allows you to discover a better one. By the 4th day, the impossible had become reality. Cliff Young was leading the race. Professional runners pushed harder. They shortened their breaks. Some even reduced their sleep, hoping to catch him. But now they were reacting to Cliff's strategy instead of following their own. The man they had left at was changing the race itself. His strange little shuffle suddenly made perfect sense. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't elegant, but it wasted very little energy. Each step required just enough effort to keep moving forward. Modern sports scientists would later study similar movement patterns in endurance events, recognizing that efficiency often matters more than speed over extreme distances. Without realizing it, Cliff had stumbled onto a remarkably effective way of covering incredible distances. Finally, after 5 days, 15 hours, and 4 minutes, Cliff Young crossed the finish line in Melbourne. He had broken the course record by almost 2 full days. The crowd erupted. Reporters rushed toward him. People who had laughed at him just days earlier were now cheering louder than anyone else. Australia had found an unlikely national hero. But perhaps the most remarkable part of the story happened after the race was already over. The winner's prize was 10,000 Australian dollars. A life-changing amount of money in 1983, especially for a potato farmer. Cliff looked surprised. He hadn't even realized there was prize money. He genuinely believed people entered simply to see whether they could finish. So he made a decision that stunned everyone. He divided the prize equally among the other top runners. He kept none of it for himself. No publicity stunt, no cameras requested. That was simply who he was. Almost overnight, Cliff Young became a legend across Australia. People admired his determination, his humility, his kindness, his refusal to believe something was impossible simply because everyone else did. He returned to farming. He continued running for years, even attempting other incredible endurance challenges well into old age. His awkward running style became famous as the Cliff Young Shuffle, inspiring runners around the world. Today, athletes intentionally practice versions of that same movement during ultramarathons, proving that what once looked ridiculous was actually surprisingly efficient. But perhaps Cliff's greatest legacy has nothing to do with running. His story reminds us how easily experience can become limitation. The professionals weren't wrong. Sleeping made sense. Their methods were based on years of knowledge. But every one of them accepted a rule that nobody had ever truly questioned. Cliff never knew that rule existed, so he accidentally discovered another possibility. History is full of breakthroughs made by people who simply didn't realize something was supposed to be impossible. Scientists, inventors, explorers, dreamers, and occasionally, a 61-year-old potato farmer wearing work boots. Cliff Young passed away in 2003. But decades later, his story continues to inspire athletes, entrepreneurs, and ordinary people across the world. Not because he was the fastest runner. He wasn't. Not because he was the strongest. He wasn't that either. His greatest strength was far simpler. He just refused to stop. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change history. Because every once in a while, the person who changes the world is the one who never learned the rules everyone else was following. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more unbelievable true legends from history, consider subscribing to Enigma Files. Because sometimes, the most incredible stories are the ones that actually happened